So let's talk about 4 unit classes that just about every army in Warhammer 40k wants in small numbers, and tend to be in borderline auto-include status when you have efficient datasheets for them. What are they, and how do they help you win the game? Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today I wanted to focus on some units with some powerful rules. As in 10th edition, Games Workshop seem to have kept them at least fairly generalised with access to them in the majority of codexes, and perhaps have a tendency to be some of the most auto-include units in their factions, at least in small numbers. I have made a few army list videos in 10th edition so far, absolutely tons of factors that can go into choosing which units to put in your army, different styles of damage dealers, and choices can be very different depending on faction and detachment. For this video though, I wanted to focus on units that tend to be boosts to the army overall, that aren't necessarily the ones that you just absolutely need for the staples of what every army wants to do, maybe things that are generally considered to be luxury add-ons, but if factions have efficient versions of them, then you very often see exactly one copy of them, as just having that special rule in your army is going to have a big benefit, nothing else really doing quite what they do. For this one I'm going to focus more on those add-on style units, so not really just the staples of 40k army list construction. There's lots of different ways that you can look at that, but maybe one way to look at it will be things like primary damage dealers, the things that are going to destroy units in the enemy army as very few lists can afford not to. Units to take and hold primary objectives, things with high OC and ideally high toughness that are going to be able to stand on a point and take a beating. Units to do secondary objectives, generally tending to be cheap, fast and expendable. Things that have low cost to be able to do actions, get to the places where they need to do them, and maybe do some skirmishing and screening with the enemy army on the way. And then usually some synergy units to tie them all together, things like leader characters to make damage combos better, models that provide whole army effects or auras. Just about every army in 40k tends to be built in a way that it's usually going to make sense to have some sort of unit synergy. Multiple datasheets working together in the right detachment, being stronger than taking individual units. Those are the things that maybe consider the staples. But for this one, let's talk about 4 units with special rules that add a lot to the army and often tends to get picked on top of this. First up, massively common units that tend to get prioritised are return to reserve style units. This one does seem to be an ability that Games Workshop has been rolling out for a whole bunch of factions. Usually the rule goes that if your unit isn't in engagement range at the end of the enemy turn, that unit can be placed back into strategic reserve. Commonly taken staples for this one could be things like the Calidus Assassin, bouncing on and off the board doing actions. It's really common to see a single unit of Tau Vespid Stingwings in an army list. Ophidian Destroyers for the Necrons can fulfill the same role. Mandrakes are borderline auto-include for the Drukhari. Space Marine Scouts are excellent, both with that and being an infiltrate unit. Zangors for the Thousand Sons are nice to have a unit of, or Gaunt's Ghost for the Astra Militarum. There are absolutely loads more than that though. Some armies might not necessarily have it on individual datasheets, but might be able to access the ability either via detachment rules, army rules, or stratagems. Maybe most notably things like the Grey Knights or the Hypercrypt Necrons, where you can have things warping back off the board each turn and have this on a sort of whole army style level. Or you could have things that can do it with stratagems, things like Deathwatch Black Spear, Vanguard Space Marines, Vanguard Tyranids, or Subterranean Assault Tyranids. We might have a stratagem that can put one or more units back into a strategic reserve. Not every army has efficient units to do this with, but there are a huge proportion of ones out there that both do have an example, and it's good enough to be basically in kind of auto-include territory. In terms of scoring mission points, perhaps the single biggest advantage is just being in easy position to do secondary objectives. Things like engage on all fronts, behind enemy lines, sabotage or establish locus might mean that you need to be in a specific position on the board. And if you have a unit that just bounces off the board and can deep strike somewhere each turn, then you'll pretty much guarantee that you have units in the right position to do this, at least unless the opponent's just screening out the whole board. And it also means that you might have units that are able to warp into position on unusual turns. If you put these units back into strategic reserve all the way on turn 1, you can do that if your opponent goes first, and then you could potentially even have things deep strike on your turn 1. It's pretty unusual to be able to deep strike things in the first battle round outside of this rule. And it also means that you can still have deep strikers effectively bouncing around the table turn 4 and turn 5 after most things have had to come in and commit. That maybe feels like the single biggest thing, particularly for the cheap versions of units that can do this, but they do have plenty of other advantages as well. It means that you can get some easy board control, maybe screening out things like enemy rapid ingress, putting things in places where units would just want to drop. They can absolutely be dealing damage at the same time as well. Things like the Necrons or the Grey Knights can line up their shooting exactly where needed, and even plenty of the utility units have at least a little bit of damage output. Things like Gaunt's Ghosts or Mandrakes could certainly chip away at some lighter units while they do their jobs. There's some units that could do this just literally for big damage dealing type purposes, say the Mysterious Guardian or the Warpborn Stalker enhancement from the Imperial or Chaos Knights, having an enormous shooting Titanic threat warp off the board and then turn up again with a perfect line of sight to their prey. Even if the only value was to deal damage, you could just have them turn up right near the enemy army and then be in a threatening position to press the attack next turn. So basically your units never get too far behind. If you look at your unit at the end of the turn and they're just not going to be able to move up and deal damage threateningly this turn. Even if your units are deep striking and arriving with a 9-inch charge, sometimes it could still be worth going for that though. It's never something to be relied upon, because even with a command point reroll, you'd still have around about a coin flip chance of getting into the objective. But sometimes the reward could be good enough to make it worth it. Say for example, some Space Marine scouts redeploy to threaten the enemy home field late in the game. Potentially they might be able to make a charge, kill a unit of chaff objective grabbers like some cultists or something, and then claim the objective for their own. You might only have a 50-50 chance of that happening, but could still be worth the gambit, as then you've slain an enemy unit and taken an absolutely vital objective and denied them victory points very directly. Overall, it's just a pretty great all-around rule, keeping your units very relevant into the late game, and allowing you to auto-complete a whole bunch of secondary objectives. It does seem that quite a few armies have got a good draw to including at least one unit if they have one. Maybe Vespid Stingwings, Gaunt's Ghost or Khaled's Assassin being a good example of that. Before we move on with our look at desirable units to add into 40k armies, I'll just give a quick shout out to today's video sponsor in Titan's Terrain. One option to get a full board of 40k related terrain on the tabletop, and it may be one of the terrain systems that do things most differently to others out there, with an emphasis on storage and portability with their system of pop-up folding cardboard tiles. The basic idea is that you have a grid of 3x4, so 12 tiles in total. That makes a 45 by 60 inch board, so the right size for 10th edition Warhammer 40k. And then for each one of those tiles, they unfold and up pops a building, sort of like a pop-up book style thing. So you can basically have a battlefield worth of 3D terrain that can be all stored completely flat, and the entire thing fits in a box set the same size as maybe a standard sized board game. So not the worst for people who've got very limited space to store terrain, or if you need to take some terrain round to a friend's house and you don't have much room to transport stuff. I have a few different designs of it available, you can check them out, links down in the video description, though I'll also cycle back to it at the end of the video. There are some trade-offs versus a more regular terrain set. In any case, check them out below if you'd like to take a look at their stuff, and thanks to them for sponsoring this one. Moving on though, next up for common additions to 40k armies that you likely want some of if you can, there's units with the Infiltrate keyword, which kind of regardless of what the unit does is a pretty big advantage in itself, being able to deploy anywhere that's greater than 9 inches from enemy units or the enemy deployment zone, so you can take the midfield right from turn 1. Generally these guys tend to pay a premium for being able to do so don't usually tend to be the biggest hitting damage and defensive style units. That kind of goes in line with what you'd want them to be. You usually want them to be cheap and expendable if they're going to be right at the front of your army and taking damage first, and then anything else they can do is a bit of a bonus. If they can skirmish well with their rivals, that's nice. If they're tough and can be hard to take down and are really quite survivable for the cost, that's a really nice bonus. And some might have other special rules around objectives, returning to reserves, or other utility things. Just given the choice between multiple infiltrate units, generally the ones that tend to get the nod are the ones that tend to be most cheap and expendable, and usually somewhere around about 1 or 2 units per army tends to be good, unless the units have got some massive draws to take more copies of them. There's really quite a lot of advantages to having at least some infiltrate units in the army, maybe the biggest ones for screening and board control and doing objectives, though occasionally they could be in position to deal some important damage. One of the biggest reasons to have at least one unit of infiltrators is to basically stop enemy infiltrators and enemy scouts doing what they want. If you have a unit of infiltrators set up in the midboard, enemy infiltrate units can't take that section of the board, and maybe you won't have the entirety of the midfield held against you right from turn 1, and because scouts can't go within 9 inches of any models, you have the potential to hold up those. Things like, say, Leagues of Votann or World Eaters, they won't enjoy having their scout moves having to stay inside their own deployment zone. And on the flip side of that, having your infiltrators stop those units moving forward means that any of your own scout move units should have a bit more freedom to operate, maybe moving up into a position behind your infiltrators. On top of that, they can give you access to some easy points with both primary and secondary objectives early in the game, maybe ones that you might struggle to get quite as easily if you didn't have infiltrators on the board. For primary objectives, you can just set them up out of line of sight on a mid-board objective. That means they're guaranteed to take that point and maybe force the opponents to move something out to try and fight over it, maybe bait them into charging with something big so you can counter-attack hard. That means that you don't necessarily have to be lining up units on the very edge of your deployment zone to be able to take that point by turn 2. There's also a whole bunch of secondary objectives that you might find it hard to do unless you have units far forward in the early game, at least on turn 1. Maybe doing things like cleanse or area denial, or an engage on all fronts could be an easy way to get more points if you've got an infiltrate unit on the board. There's a good chance they could flip some points from being undoable to being kind of fine. For deploying them, it can often make sense to drop them kind of early if your opponent's got enemy infiltrators as well, as that means that you can deny areas of the board to them. Otherwise, though, it's probably similar and wanting to deploy them last for more information, to know which units they're going to have to deal with and where they could deploy safe or where they could move to try and hold things up or annoy enemy units. Redeploy abilities can be really quite powerful with them. You have to redeploy units before you know who's got first turn these days, but that still means you could basically have infiltrators with kind of perfect knowledge deployment, seeing exactly what the opponent's put down and then putting them in the most useful position to be, maybe the right combination of hidden safe or in a position to move up and be annoying, maybe if it made sense to and you had first turn. Speaking of that, certain infiltrators absolutely could be a big deal for some alpha strike damage, maybe if there's some exposed lone operatives, or an enemy unit that's just really quite fragile but quite dangerous or useful in its own way, having the option to throw in some things like some pure strain gene stealers, or an unlikely charge with some space marine scouts seems good. And sometimes they could have enough value even if they don't destroy anything, and just park some units in between some ruins and hold up an entire chunk of the enemy army. Say for some Imperial Knights with a whole bunch of Knight armigers, they wouldn't enjoy that being trapped in their own deployment zone for a crucial turn of the game. Overall, between all that, for armies that have access to at least some cheap infiltrators, it basically means that they're near enough auto-include, maybe diminishing returns after you get past 2 units of them. I feel like a lot of lists tend to just take 1 unit of infiltrate style units, or maybe 2 of them, depending on how good they are and how cheap they are. For the next entry in special rules to boost the overall winning of a game, we've got sticky objectives units, which I talked about in a video not so very long ago. Again, they're another great example of just a unit in army list that often tend to be taken in at least 1 copy of them if you've got the rule for fairly cheap. And having at least 1 unit that's able to do it on the board can have a fairly outsized value, provided the rest of the unit is efficient enough to make that worth it. The rules for this one, it's usually if you hold this objective in your command phase, then it'll remain yours until your opponent controls it at the end of any phase. Some rules still reference turns instead of phases, and for a lot of armies it adds enough value to encourage at least 1 unit with that rule, maybe things like Intercessors, Chaos Cultists, Hearthkin Warriors, Kroot Carnivores, Battle Sisters, and plenty more. Some lists might take multiple copies of them, but if you haven't got at least 1 of them, then it kind of adds outsized value. Plenty of armies get access to it, either with detachment or stratagem rules though, and that can also be well worth the trade-off, perhaps in particular Chaos Knights at the moment being well known for that, with their super flexible version of this with the 5OC defending it. That's a really powerful leg up in the primary objective game. The main reason to take these is to mark the home field objective with it, as it just gives you a whole bunch of different options with defending it and different decisions that you could make, all of which can help you against that objective getting taken and making more maximal use of your units. If you've claimed a unit with sticky objectives, then if that unit gets shot down by the enemy, then the point remains yours and they can't deny it to you that way. Say there were some Chaos Cultists on the home field objective, some Inceptors deep struck near them and cleared them all out, the objective would still be yours unless they could actually make it onto the point. If the unit survives, it could allow you to counter-attack on the home objective. Say some World Eaters Jackals have some deep strikers land nearby them. If it made more sense to, rather than having to sit around on the objective, they could charge out and chop up the aggressors with their chain blades, safe in the knowledge that the point remains yours. It's maybe not unhelpful to have the fight happening not on the objective, so if the opponent prevails, then it doesn't immediately become theirs. It could allow your units on the home board to do a late game push, say after a bunch of the fighting has happened. If the opponent doesn't have any units that are going to be in a position to threaten to take your home field objective, anything that's sat on the home field objective can basically commit to the mid board. Maybe it could be nice with Azrael with some Intercessors, for example. He can generate command points for a few turns nice and safe, and then push to the midfield and use their damage and defense to try and take some more points or destroy a few more enemies later in the game. It could work well with other things like, say, Ursula Creed and some Cadian shock troops using move to throw themselves into the mid-board and deal a bit of damage and hopefully take some objectives. Potentially it could allow you to deep strike screen a bit better. If the point's still yours, you could potentially have units that could deep strike screen either side of it, so the opponent can deep strike absolutely nowhere near the points, and then even if they manage to charge one of your units out of reserve, they're basically going to be wiping out a unit that's not even on an objective, so they can't tip the point there. It could be helpful if your unit fails Battle Shock, maybe a bit more niche, but handy enough against things like Tyrannid Shadow in the Warp. And if your sticky objective style units are ones that can be actually okay for damage and defense sort of purposes, having them overrun things in the mid-board and marking points for sticky objectives means they can move on to the next target, maybe Orc Boys being a good example of that. It means that they don't have to sit around on objective guard duty watching the fights happen near them. They can get stuck in and throw a bunch more chopper attacks into the mix. knowing that point will remain orky if the opponent doesn't have anything that can move on to it next turn. Overall, again, it's another one where units can just have some outsized value for having one unit in the army list that does it. It's just super common to see one unit of Space Marine Intercessors in a Space Marine army right now. They can mark the home board and then might do something useful with their horde clearing bolt guns a bit later on. But overall, they have just a lot of value, allowing those kind of objective options, while also having some damage defense and OC of their own. Finally, for another unit class that tends to have kind of outsized representation, provided the points mass adds up on it, are things that can generate or manipulate command points for multiple units nearby. I feel like compared with the previous three, these ones tend to be a little bit more hit and miss depending on how much the points cost for the units in question is. But again, they feel like another example where if the points cost are right on them, just about every army in the game is absolutely going to want to make use of them, as command points in 40k are a pretty mighty resource, each one basically able to produce an interesting swing in the game, whether or not it's saving the lives of a few key models through a defensive stratagem, cutting down a bunch of enemies early due to overwatch, or re-rolling a critical failed charge. There's usually a fair few opportunities in the game where a command point or stratagem is literally going to be the difference between 100 or so points of enemy units dying or yours dying. Whether or not any specific factions versions are outright worth it though does depend on the points cost and exactly what they do. The maths on many of them do tend to work rather well. For example, Orc Gretchin are pretty well auto-include for them, just 40-point units that have some defensive value and a whole bunch of OC. Giving you a command point on a coin flip every second turn is pretty excellent. Or you have big chunky units like Bjorn the Fell-Handed that have a fair bit of damage and defense threat in their own right, but you could sort of just see the command point generation that he does as being just sort of part of his overall value. Where I did some polls and just general ideas about the rule. Earlier in 10th edition, people felt like they'd value an automatic command point generation somewhere around about, say, 30 to 35 points or so if you could buy it in as an enhancement. Obviously, that's all a bit of an arbitrary estimation, but it doesn't feel terrible as a rule of thumb. You could see Bjorn's datasheet as having around about 30 to 40 points worth of the cost made up out of his command point generation rule. So provided you know he's reliably going to be doing that for a good few turns, you could look at the rest of his stat line as an unusually tough and fighty dreadnought for essentially around about 130 points or so for what he does in terms of his battle abilities. For his command point generation units, in general the way that they tend to want to play though is to make sure that you can get good value out of them for a good amount of turns, and that usually means playing just a bit more cagey with him. Say for example, Azrael with the Intercessors that we mentioned a second ago. To make good use out of his command point farming, it just kind of makes sense that he is able to trigger that, say on turns 1, 2 and 3. So it might make sense to maybe move him up the board and get ready to strike potentially, but not necessarily actually commit to battle until say turn 3 or turn 4. Being part of the second wave of units trying to push towards the mid-board objective seems like a good idea for him, as then you've got lots of value out of his command point rerolls, and then in the last few turns you can go on to make some good value out of his damage rules and his squad. Maybe Tyranid Hive Tyrants could be another good example of that. Not the best defensive stats compared with some other Tyranid monsters, but you could just play a bit cagey with them for the first few turns and use their stratagems, and then it commits to the main fight towards the end of the game, and maybe somewhat similar with Rabute Gilliman. Overall, it feels that a whole bunch of armies do have enough units that are well worth it from that sort of generation point of view, but it definitely doesn't make them auto-include like the rest of the units if they're paying too many points for their abilities. I would bear in mind that in theory land around command point generation as well. In the mission deck missions, if you happen to drop the tactical objective, then that generates you a command point, and that wouldn't overlap or stack with the one that you get from the character. So it would mean that if you're dropping 1 or 2 over the course of a game, you might not get quite as many command points out of your character as you would have had those anyway. Could just lessen their theoretical value a little bit, but doesn't stop certain ones from being utterly auto-include. Maybe things like Gretchin or Azrael being very good examples of that. I'll leave that one there for now though. Let me know your thoughts down in the comments. Which of these units does your army have some good examples or options to be able to field? Do they make it into your list? And does your faction have any holes where you really wanted to have one of these unit classes, but at the moment it doesn't exist, or Games Workshop haven't made it an appropriate points cost? That's the end of this one, though I'll just quickly cycle back to Titan's Terrain, the video sponsor, before I go, to briefly talk through some pros, cons and examples for their folding cardboard pop-up terrain. As mentioned in the earlier segment, I feel like it's maybe got a few more obvious trade-offs versus more standard 40k terrain systems, the biggest single advantage being it's really easy to store on transports due to the whole folding system, literally fitting in a board game box. Of course it's far cheaper than a whole board of Games Workshop terrain, or at least somewhat comparable to things like cheaper MDF, and it also doesn't need any painting or assembly as well, coming pre-coloured and ready to go immediately for people wanting to dedicate their hobby time towards their armies. It does have some potential downsides though that could put some people off. It is a bit less sturdy and hard wearing than plastic or MDF given it's made of cardboard board and designs to fold flat, you do need to look after it a bit more, and it can be kind of hard or impossible to put models in the upper floors of buildings that aren't really very load bearing. The grid layout can be a bit less flexible than some, and it means that it can create some firing lanes in 40k 10th edition. Might not be the worst idea just to have an extra wall or two to try and break them up to put on top of the terrain. It doesn't really make tournament approved style layouts if that's what you're going for, but I feel like it can do the job nice enough for more casual games. In any case, they do have a few different designs of it available. They've got a sort of Chaos Foundry one called the Forgotten Furnace, with a bunch of glowing runes and factories and things. There's a more standard Shattered Hive one with a bunch of bombed out buildings and armoured containers and the like, a fairly standard ruined city. And then they've got a sort of more verdant set of ruins called the Overgrown Capital, this one with ruins appropriate enough for either a fantasy or a grimdark setting perhaps. Each of those also has an expansion centerpiece set, made by putting 2 tiles together to make one great big building. There's a spire for the factories, and a cathedral type thing for the other 2. In any case, thanks to them for sponsoring the video. You can find them linked down in the video description if you'd like to take a look over their stuff. That's the end of this one though. If you'd like to hear more like this, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics. I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming with new ones out just about every day. If you've been enjoying the videos on the channel, then feel free to subscribe to the channel's Patreon page. That's linked down in the video description, and it's the main thing that keeps all the content coming on Auspex Tactics, so a massive thank you to anyone supporting. Channel patrons do get a few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link's down in the video description. In any case though, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.